On December 20th, 1991, the Ukrainian parliament issued the following appeal. According to its legal status, Ukraine is an independent state, a subject of international law. Ukraine opposes the transformation of the Commonwealth of Independent States into a state formation with its own ruling and administrative bodies. This was a response to Russian President Boris Yeltsin's attempts to use the Commonwealth of Independent States as a modern Soviet organization, where Ukraine would retain joint sovereignty with Russia. But the Ukrainians were after a clean divorce, not a second engagement. In January 1993, Ukraine refused to sign the Statute of the Commonwealth, meaning that it would not become a full member of the Commonwealth of Independent States. Throughout the 90s, the Ukrainian parliament refused to sign several other agreements for collective security. The Ukrainians set about establishing their own armed forces and navy. However, the huge Soviet army, which had more than 80,000 officers and men stationed in Ukrainian territory, would not leave of its own volition. The reality was that they had nowhere to go. Russia was already unable to cope with hundreds of thousands of troops returning from Central and Eastern Europe. It was therefore decided to transform the Soviet military in Ukraine into a Ukrainian military. The first group of Soviet officers swore their allegiance to Ukraine on January 3, 1992. About 10,000 officers refused to take the oath and were either retired or transferred. In January of 1994, in a deal called the Budapest Memorandum brokered by the United States, Ukraine agreed to give up the nuclear weapons it had inherited from the USSR. According to that agreement, the US, Russia, and Great Britain provided security assurance to Ukraine. The first major conflict between Ukraine and Russia occurred in May of 1992, when the Admiral of the Soviet Black Fleet refused to take the oath of allegiance to Ukraine and sailed his fleet out into the open sea. A few months later, Presidents Kravchuk and Yeltsin agreed to divide the fleet, thus avoiding direct conflict. In 1997, the two countries signed a friendship treaty that guaranteed Ukrainian territorial integrity. By the end of the 20th century, it appeared therefore as if Ukraine's divorce from Russia was complete. However, the 1990s also inflicted great hardship upon the Ukrainian people. By the year 2000, more than half the population did not have enough money to buy food. The economic hardships in Ukraine were directly tied to the collapse of the Soviet economy. Ukraine had no oil or gas revenues, and the Ukrainian metallurgical industry, which fueled the economy, relied entirely on Russian natural gas supplies. It now had to pay exorbitant prices to get it. In the early 2000s, a new class of owners and managers managed to revive Ukraine's economy. These ones were known as oligarchs, and they had benefited greatly by the sale of government assets at a fraction of their real value. These men were often corrupt, but their overtaking of the metallurgical industry gave an injection to the economy and led to a rapid recovery in the early 2000s. In the 2004 election, Viktor Yanukovych was elected as Ukraine's fourth president in an election that was obviously rigged. The supporters of the legitimate winner, Viktor Yushchenko, were outraged. Soon, 200,000 of them were marching on the Maidan, Kyiv's Independence Square. Over the coming days and weeks, the number of protesters only grew. This became known as the Orange Revolution, after the official colors of Yushchenko's political party. Images of the movement were broadcast around the world. European politicians, led by Polish President Aleksander Kwasniewski, intervened and convinced the Ukrainian president to back a call for the Constitutional Court to annul the election result and call a new election. The new election was held on December 26, 2004. Yushchenko won with 52% of the vote. During the election campaign, however, Yushchenko became gravely ill. He was found to have ingested a poisonous substance and suffered disfigurement. It is widely acknowledged that he was poisoned by the Russians. He survived and went on to rule, though he failed to deliver on many of his election promises. In 2010, Viktor Yanukovych won the election with 48% of the vote. Over the next few years, he began to establish ever-growing relations with Russia. By 2013, it was widely felt that Yanukovych was nothing more than a puppet of Russian President Vladimir Putin. This gave rise to the Euromaidan protests. Once again, the Maidan Square in Kyiv was the center point of the protests. On January 16th, the government introduced new anti-protest laws. This only caused more people to pour out into the streets. Riots took place on February 18th through the 20th. The authorities cracked down without mercy, with 98 people being killed, 15,000 injured, and more than 100 simply going missing. On February 21st, President Yanukovych tried to appease the protesters by offering to hold new elections, but the people wanted nothing less than his resignation. He was soon ousted, and a new election was held. The new president was Petro Poroshenko, a Ukrainian businessman and politician who served for the next 5 years. The removal of Putin's man in Ukraine prompted the Russian president to fast-track his annexation of Crimea. Putin was determined to rebuild the Soviet Socialist Republic. He ordered Russian troops stationed at the Sevastopol naval base to disarm Ukrainian troops. More Russian troops then marched into Crimea. On March 16, 2014, a referendum was imposed upon the people of Crimea. Not surprisingly, 97% of them voted to become part of Russia. The United Nations General Assembly declared the referendum illegal, but had no power to do anything about it. Meanwhile, in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions close to the Russian border, pro-Russian militia seized government buildings and police stations. These ones proclaimed the People's Republic of Donetsk and the Luhansk People's Republic. Ukrainian government forces moved in to attempt to oust these rebels. A ceasefire was reached in February 2015. According to the agreement reached, all foreign troops were to withdraw, and Ukraine would have control of the border with Russia. In March 2018, the members of a Ukrainian TV production company called Kvartal 95 registered a new political party. They called it Servant of the People, which was the same name as a TV show they had been producing for the past 3 years. The star of the show, Volodymyr Zelensky, was put up as their presidential candidate. Although a complete political novice, Zelensky quickly established a lead in the polls. He ended up winning the election with 72% of the vote. Zelensky promised to end the growing escalation with Russia and enter into a productive dialogue with Vladimir Putin. The Russian president, however, had other ideas. In the closing months of 2021, Russia began to build up its troop strength along the Russian-Ukrainian border, as well as along Ukraine's border with Belarus. As the buildup escalated, Putin insisted that he had no intentions to invade Ukraine, but that his army was simply involved in a military exercise. However, in December of 2021, United States intelligence sources released information showing that the Russians fully intended to invade Ukraine. Throughout January of 2022, the Russians made repeated accusations against the Ukrainians of inciting tensions and repressing Russians living within Ukraine. Putin stated that Russophobia was taking place, which, according to him, was the first step toward genocide. He also claimed that the Ukrainian government was packed with neo-Nazis. This claim was vehemently denied by Zelensky, who happens to be Jewish. Putin demanded that Ukraine be prevented from ever joining NATO. This was rejected by the international community. On February 17th, there were clashes between the Russian and Ukrainian forces on the Donetsk and Luhansk regions. Then, on February 22nd, Putin sent his forces across the border on what he termed a peacekeeping mission. Donetsk and Luhansk were immediately claimed as independent sovereign states. 2 days later, Putin launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. He termed it a special military operation to demilitarize and denazify the country. Later that day, the Russians took control of the nuclear power plant at Chernobyl. Putin believed that he would have control of Ukraine in a few days. However, he had grossly underestimated the resolve of the Ukrainian people. With the war raging for 1 month as of this recording, the Ukrainian people are more resolved than ever to resist the invasion to the last breath. The Russians have failed to take control of any major cities, despite having overwhelming numbers. We don't know how this part of Ukraine's history will play out. What we do know is that the proud spirit of Ukraine will never die.